On the morning of June 22 ND, 1941, 3 million German soldiers crossed the longest invasion front in the history of warfare. They moved east into the Soviet Union along a line stretching nearly 2,000 miles, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The largest military operation ever mounted by a single nation against another had begun. And within 4 years, it would kill somewhere between 27 and 30 million Soviet citizens, destroy the German armed forces as an effective fighting machine, and determine the outcome of the Second World War more completely than any other single campaign in the conflict. The standard explanation for why Hitler invaded the Soviet Union is simple. He hated communism. He hated Slavic peoples. He wanted living space in the East. He was an ideological fanatic who believed that the Soviet Union was a Jewish Bolshevik state that had to be destroyed. And all of that is true. All of it is documented in his writings, his speeches, his private conversations, his orders. None of it is disputed by serious historians. But the standard explanation, while true, is incomplete. It tells you what Hitler believed. It does not fully tell you why he acted when he did. It does not tell you what calculations he made, what fears drove him, what opportunities we thought he saw, what economic pressures had become critical by the summer of 1941, and what strategic logic, however flawed, produced the specific decision to attack the Soviet Union at a specific moment and in the specific way that he did. The real reasons Hitler invaded Russia are more complicated, more layered, and in some ways more instructive about the nature of the decision than the ideological explanation alone. They involve oil. They involve food. They involve the relationship between the German war economy and the raw materials of the East. They involve Hitler's reading of American intentions and a calculation about the timeline of American intervention. They involve a strategic assessment of Britain's position that was, at the moment of decision, not entirely irrational. And they involve a fundamental misunderstanding of the Soviet Union's capacity to absorb destruction and keep fighting that was, perhaps, the single most consequential intelligence failure in the history of modern warfare. To understand the decision to invade the Soviet Union, you have to begin not in June 1941 but in September tahun 1939. With the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the non-aggression agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was one of the most shocking diplomatic events of the 20th century. Two ideologically opposed states, whose leaders had spent years denouncing each other as the primary enemy of civilization, signed an agreement not to attack each other and secretly divided Eastern Europe between them. Poland was invaded from the west by Germany and from the east by the Soviet Union. The Baltic states were absorbed into the Soviet sphere. Finland was invaded, though the winter war that followed proved far more difficult than Stalin had anticipated. For Hitler, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was always a tactical arrangement, not a strategic commitment. He said so privately and repeatedly to his inner circle, both before and after it was signed. The agreement bought Germany time to deal with France and Britain without the nightmare of a two-front war that had destroyed Germany in the First World War. It secured Germany's eastern border while the western campaign proceeded. And it provided Germany with access to Soviet raw materials, oil from the Caucasus, grain from Ukraine, timber, manganese, and the dozens of other commodities that the British naval blockade was cutting off from Germany's access to world markets. The trade relationship that developed between Germany and the Soviet Union under the pact was, in the period between September tahun 1939 and June 1941, of genuine economic importance to Germany. Soviet oil, grain, and the raw materials flowed west into Germany. German manufactured goods, weapons blueprints, naval technology, and the industrial equipment flowed east into the Soviet Union. The relationship functioned. It supported the German war economy, and it should, by purely rational economic calculation, have been maintained as long as the war with Britain continued. But Hitler was not thinking in purely rational economic terms. He was thinking in ideological terms, in racial terms, in terms of a long-range historical vision that he had held since at least the early 1920s, and that the writing of Mein Kampf had crystallized into something approaching a fixed program. The East, specifically the vast agricultural and the resource-rich territory of the Soviet Union, was in Hitler's vision the necessary foundation for German continental dominance. It was the Lebensraum, the living space, that would provide Germany with the agricultural land, the population room, and the raw material base to compete as a world power against the maritime empires of Britain and the anticipated future competition with America. This was not a new idea in German political thought. The concept of eastward expansion as Germany's natural direction of imperial ambition had a long history in German political culture, stretching back through the pan-German movement of the late 19th century and defining its most extreme expression in the wartime planning of the Brest-Litovsk settlement in 1918. When Imperial Germany had imposed on the collapsing Russian state a peace treaty that stripped away Ukraine, the Baltic states, and the large portions of Russian territory. Hitler had studied the history of that settlement carefully. He had drawn from it the lesson that the East was vulnerable, that Russian power was brittle, and that a sufficiently decisive blow could strip away the territory that Germany needed in a campaign that the Russian state could not survive. The Spanish Civil War, the Austrian annexation, the Czech crisis, and the fall of France had all confirmed Hitler's belief in his own strategic genius and his contempt for the professional military's caution. Each time he had overridden the general's objections and each time he had been right, or at least right enough to achieve his objectives. The pattern of success had produced a confidence that was indistinguishable, by the summer of 1940, from certainty. But beneath the ideological commitment and the strategic vision, there were pressing practical reasons that made the invasion of the Soviet Union feel, to Hitler and a significant portion of the German military and the economic leadership, not just desirable but necessary by the summer of 1941. Here was the most critical. Germany's oil situation in 1940 and 1941 was a source of genuine strategic anxiety at the highest levels of the German command. Germany had virtually no more domestic oil production. Its primary synthetic fuel program, which used coal-to-oil conversion processes developed by German chemical engineering, was producing significant quantities of aviation fuel and motor fuel but could not come close to meeting the Wehrmacht's wartime requirements at the scale of operations being contemplated. Romania, specifically the oil fields around Ploiești, was Germany's primary conventional oil source. But Ploiești's production was finite, its infrastructure was vulnerable. And the Soviet Union's proximity to Romania made German planners nervous about the long-term security of that supply. The Caucasus oil fields, centered on Baku in what is now Azerbaijan, represented one of the largest concentrations of petroleum production in the world at that time. Controlling Baku would simultaneously secure Germany's oil supply for any level of sustained military operations and deny that oil to the Soviet war machine. For a German military that was burning oil at extraordinary rates and a German economy that was running its synthetic fuel plants at maximum capacity while still falling short of requirements, the prospect of Caucasus oil was not an abstract strategic objective. It was a pressing operational necessity. Food was the second critical resource. The German food situation in 1941 was significantly more difficult than the regime was willing to publicly acknowledge. The British naval blockade had cut off Germany's access to global food markets. The agricultural productivity of Germany itself was constrained by the diversion of agricultural labor into the military and the war industries. Rationing had been introduced and it was being tightened. The Soviet Union's Ukraine region, the breadbasket of Eastern Europe, produced grain and the agricultural products in quantities that could, in German strategic planning, resolve Germany's food security concerns for the duration of the war and beyond. The planning documents for Operation Barbarossa, specifically a set of internal German planning papers known as the Hunger Plan developed by Herbert Bach in the Reich Ministry of Food, are among the most revealing and disturbing documents of the entire Nazi period. They discuss, with bureaucratic precision and without moral language of any kind, the exploitation of occupied Soviet territory food production. They acknowledge explicitly that feeding German troops from Soviet food resources would require reducing the food available to Soviet civilians to below subsistence levels. They calculate the resulting deaths in terms of economic efficiency rather than human cost. The Hunger Plan was not a contingency document or an extreme scenario planning exercise. It was the operational framework for how Germany intended to manage the food resources of the territory it expected to conquer. The third practical pressure was the relationship between Germany's military situation and the timeline of American involvement. Hitler was watching American policy with increasing concern through 1940 and into ke 1941. Roosevelt's Land-Lease Program, signed into law in March 1941, had fundamentally altered the American relationship with Britain from nominal neutrality to active material support. American naval vessels were escorting convoys in the Western Atlantic. American public opinion, while still largely isolationist, was shifting, and Hitler's intelligence services were providing him with assessments that suggested American military involvement in the European war was a matter of when rather than whether. The window of time available to Germany to achieve a decisive continental victory before American power could be brought to bear was, in Hitler's calculation, limited. If Germany could destroy the Soviet Union in 1941, secure the resources of the East, and present Britain with the reality of a German-dominated continent from which America could not dislodge it, the war might be won before American involvement could change the calculation. This was not an irrational assessment, given the information available to Hitler in the spring of ke 1941. It was a gamble certainly, but it was a gamble with a discernible strategic logic. The fourth pressure was Britain itself. By the summer of 1940, after Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain, it was clear that Germany could not successfully invade the British Isles with the naval and the air forces available. Britain would not be knocked out of the war by direct assault, but Britain's ability to continue the war depended on the assessment that the balance would eventually shift in its favor, that the United States would eventually intervene, and that the Soviet Union's existence as a potential Eastern ally, or at least a constraint on German power, meant that Germany could not concentrate everything against Britain indefinitely. Hitler's logic, expressed in conversations with his military commanders in the spring of 1941, was that destroying the Soviet Union would remove Britain's hope of a continental ally and compel the British to negotiate. Churchill, in this analysis, was maintaining the war not because he believed Britain could defeat Germany alone, but because he believed Germany would eventually face a two-front war that it could not win. Remove the Eastern Front, remove the prospect of Soviet resistance, and the Britain's strategic position became genuinely hopeless. The British would then either negotiate or wait for American intervention. But American intervention without a continental ally would be a much slower and the more uncertain path to German defeat than the current trajectory. This analysis was not entirely wrong about Britain's position. Churchill had said privately, and occasionally publicly, that he believed Germany's decision to invade the Soviet Union was the development that had finally convinced him Britain would ultimately win the war. The corollary of that is that before June 22 ND, 1941, Churchill was not certain of it. The military planning for Operation Barbarossa began in earnest in the summer of 1940, immediately after the fall of France. General Erich Marx produced an initial operational concept in July 1940. The final plan, developed by the Wehrmacht's operational planning staff, envisioned 3 army groups attacking simultaneously along the full length of the front. Army Group North would drive through the Baltic states to Leningrad. Army Group Center would advance through Belarus toward Moscow. Army Group South would sweep through Ukraine toward Kiev and the Donbas industrial region and ultimately toward the Caucasus. The planning was based on a series of assumptions, some of which were reasonable and some of which were catastrophically wrong. The reasonable assumptions included the Wehrmacht's tactical superiority over the Red Army at the level of operational command, the likelihood of major Soviet forces being encircled and destroyed in the initial weeks by the German armored spearheads, and the vulnerability of the Soviet command system to the initial shock of the attack. The catastrophically wrong assumptions were about depth, resilience, and the time. German intelligence fundamentally underestimated the size of the Soviet armed forces. When German forces destroyed what they believed were the main Soviet reserve formations in the initial weeks of the campaign, no Soviet formations continued to appear. Soviet industrial relocation, which moved factory complexes from the Western Soviet Union to sites beyond the Urals before German forces could capture them, was something German intelligence had not considered as a serious possibility. The Soviet Union's capacity to absorb territorial losses that would have destroyed any Western European state, to lose the most productive agricultural regions, the most developed industrial areas, the largest cities, and to keep fighting, was something that German planning had not adequately incorporated. The opening weeks of Barbarossa were, in terms of tactical military achievement, among the most stunning in the history of warfare. The German advance moved with a speed and comprehensiveness that genuinely shocked both the Allied observers watching from outside and the Soviet military command on the inside. The border battles of late June 1941 resulted in the destruction of enormous quantities of Soviet equipment and the encirclement of hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. The Minsk encirclement in the first weeks resulted in the capture of over 300,000 prisoners. The Smolensk battles in July resulted in further massive encirclements. And the Kiev encirclement in September, the largest encirclement in military history, resulted in the capture of over 600,000 Soviet soldiers. These were numbers that should have broken a European army. They had broken armies in the past. The French had surrendered after losing significantly less territory and fewer men. The pace of the German advance in the initial weeks led German military planners and Hitler himself to conclude that the campaign was progressing toward the expected decisive outcome. But the Soviet Union did not behave like France. The political leadership did not collapse. Stalin, despite a period of near paralysis in the first days after the invasion when the scale of the disaster became clear, remained in Moscow and in power. The NKVD and the party apparatus maintained control behind the front even as the front itself was catastrophically disrupted. No armies were formed, trained, and deployed with a speed that German intelligence had not anticipated. And the territorial depth of the Soviet Union meant that even the largest encirclements and the advances were consuming only the western fraction of the country's military potential. The relationship between ideology and the operational decision-making in Barbarossa was direct and deadly. The Wehrmacht's operations in the east were conducted under a set of orders that distinguished them fundamentally from the German military's operations in the west. The Commissar order directed German forces to execute Soviet political commissars captured in battle, bypassing the prisoner of war protections of international law. The criminal orders generally directed German forces to treat the civilian population of occupied Soviet territory according to the racial and the ideological classifications of the regime rather than the laws of war. These orders were not universally obeyed. Some commanders refused to implement them. Some implemented them partially. But their existence and their substantial implementation shaped the nature of the campaign in ways that had direct operational consequences. The brutality of the German occupation in the East, the mass shootings by the Einsatzgruppen and mobile killing units that followed the Wehrmacht's advance and the murdered Jewish populations, communist officials, and the others designated as enemies of the Reich. The deliberate starvation policies applied to prisoner of war camps where Soviet prisoners died by the millions, the systematic devastation of occupied territory, all of this produced a resistance and a determination in the Soviet population that purely military logic might not have generated. Partisan movements emerged behind the German lines that tied down significant military resources. Civilians who might in other circumstances have welcomed any alternative to Stalinist rule instead found themselves in a situation where the German alternative was demonstrably worse. The decision to treat the Soviet campaign as a war of racial annihilation rather than a conventional military campaign was both ideologically driven and operationally counterproductive. It was perhaps the most consequential example of ideology overriding military rationality in the entire German conduct of the war. The German advance slowed through the autumn of 1941 as the logistical strains of the enormous campaign distances began to tell. The Wehrmacht had been designed and equipped for the short, decisive campaigns of Poland and France. It was not equipped for a sustained campaign across the vast distances of the Soviet Union. The supply lines stretched to the point of breakdown. The roads of the Soviet Union, unpaved for the most part and devastated by the autumn rains that turned them into mud, made movement of supplies and reinforcements progressively more difficult. The horses on which German logistics heavily depended died in enormous numbers. The vehicles broke down in conditions they had not been designed to withstand. The failure to take Moscow in 1941, which we have examined in the context of Hitler's specific decision to divert Army Group Centre's armor to the Kiev encirclement before resuming the Moscow drive, was the moment when the original conception of Barbarossa as a decisive campaign that would destroy the Soviet Union before winter was definitively abandoned. By December 1941, when the Soviet counteroffensive before Moscow drove German forces back from the closest approach they ever made to the Soviet capital, the war had become something fundamentally different from what it had been planned as. It had become a prolonged struggle of attrition between the world's largest military-industrial economies on a front of 2,000 miles in conditions of extreme climate and geography. It was exactly the kind of war that Germany, with its limited resources, its constrained population base, and its existing commitments on multiple fronts, could not win. The real reason Hitler invaded Russia, examined across all its dimensions, was not a single reason but a convergence of factors that made the invasion seem, in the spring of 1941, both ideologically necessary and strategically urgent. The ideology was primary. Without the racial and the ideological framework that identified the East as Germany's essential space and the Soviet Union as a Jewish Bolshevik enemy that had to be destroyed, none of the strategic calculations would have pointed in the same direction. The ideology determined the direction. The economic pressures, the oil, the food, the raw materials determined the urgency. The strategic calculation about American intervention and the Britain's position provided the timeline logic. And the consistent pattern of military success against opponents who had proven far weaker than expected provided the confidence, the overconfidence that made the gimbal seem acceptable. What Hitler got fundamentally wrong was the Soviet Union itself. He understood it as a hollow structure, a rotting edifice held together by terror and the ideology that would collapse when struck with sufficient force. He understood its population through a racial lens that prevented him from seeing human capacity and the resilience where his ideology told him only racial inferiority existed. He understood its geography as space to be crossed rather than as a strategic factor that would progressively work against him as the advance extended. And he understood its economic and the military potential as fixed rather than as something that would mobilize against him in ways that his 6-week supply plan had made no more provision for. The aftermath of Barbarossa's failure was the complete destruction of the German armed forces as a strategic instrument. Over 4 million German soldiers died on the Eastern Front between 1941 and 1945. The campaign consumed the manpower, the equipment, the fuel, and the irreplaceable trained military personnel that Germany could not replace at the rate they were being lost. By 1943, after Stalingrad, the initiative on the Eastern Front had passed permanently to the Soviet Union. By 1944, Soviet forces were driving into German-held territory in offensives of a scale and the sophistication that matched and in some respects surpassed anything the Wehrmacht had achieved in its years of dominance. The Soviet Union's victory on the Eastern Front came at a cost that is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Estimates of total Soviet wartime deaths range from 27 to 30 million, encompassing military losses, deliberate killings of civilians by the German occupation, deaths from hunger and the disease caused by the occupation policies, and the deaths of Soviet prisoners of war, of whom approximately 3.5 million died in German captivity, a death rate of over 50% that stands in stark contrast to the treatment of Western Allied prisoners. The scale of destruction in the occupied territory, the cities, the villages, the agricultural infrastructure, the transportation network, the cultural heritage, was catastrophic and in some respects irreversible. The lessons that military historians and the strategists have drawn from Barbarossa are numerous and have been studied intensively in the decades since. The failure of intelligence to accurately assess the enemy's capacity. The danger of planning based on optimistic assumptions about the speed of decisive outcomes. The operational consequences of ideologically driven policies that generate resistance rather than submission. The impossibility of sustaining a campaign of continental scale on a logistical foundation designed for short decisive operations. And above all, the fundamental error of confusing an opponent's political vulnerability with military fragility, of believing that because a state is oppressive, corrupt, or ideologically bankrupt, it is therefore militarily weak. The Soviet Union under Stalin was all of the first things. Its political system was oppressive, corrupt, and guilty of crimes against its own population that rival any atrocity of the Nazi period. But it was not militarily weak in the way that Hitler's ideological framework insisted it must be. Its people, whatever they thought of the Stalin regime, were capable of extraordinary sacrifice in defense of their country, their families, and their land. and the identification of the German invasion as a war of racial extermination rather than a conventional military operation, which the behavior of the German occupying forces made unmistakably clear within weeks of the campaign's opening, removed any possibility that the Soviet population might choose to cooperate with or submit to German occupation as an alternative to a fight to the death. The real reason Hitler invaded Russia was that he believed, with the particular confidence of a man who has never been proven seriously wrong in a major gamble, that he could win quickly enough to change the strategic situation before the costs of the campaign became prohibitive. He was wrong. The campaign's costs became prohibitive before it achieved any of its decisive objectives. And the failure of Barbarossa set in motion a chain of consequences that led, 4 years of extraordinary destruction later, the German forces fighting street by street in the ruins of Berlin while Soviet tanks closed in from the east. The Soviet soldier who planted the red flag on the Reichstag building in May 1945, in the photograph that became one of the defining images of the 20th century, between that certainty and that flag, 30 million people died. That is the final, unresolvable truth of Operation Barbarossa. Not the strategic mistake, not the intelligence failure, not the operational overextension, though all of those are a part of the story. The final truth is the human cost of a decision made by one man, based on a worldview that the evidence could never have supported, and that the reality of the Soviet Union's capacity and the determination exploded within months of the campaign's opening. The price of that decision was paid not by the man who made it but by the tens of millions of human beings on both sides, who had no more voice in the making of it and no more choice about bearing its consequences. History does not offer verdicts on decisions made by the dead, it offers evidence. The evidence of Barbarossa is written in 30 million graves stretching from the Vistula to the Volga. That evidence does not require interpretation. It requires only that those who come after it refuse to look away.